2010, there was this guy named Nate Smith, who was living in Oregon with his family. And unfortunately, in the fall of 2010, his father, the patriarch of the family, suddenly passed away. And it was sudden, and the family was one of those families. It was Nate, his mom, and I believe he had a sister. I know he had at least one other sibling. The four of them spent a lot of time together. That was sort of, whenever they were not at work or school, this was a family that spent a lot of time together. And they especially spent a lot of time together outdoors. They were a very outdoorsy family. They liked to fish, they liked to hunt, go hiking. They lived out near Mount Bachelor in Oregon. Mount Bachelor is like this beautiful, I believe there's a ski resort there, but picture the huge mountains, snow, pine trees, it's beautiful. And so when this father passed, it sort of immediately created this new, very difficult dynamic. I mean, in addition to there being obviously grief associated and shock associated with his passing, there was also this sudden rupture in the way Nate and his mom and his other siblings sort of lived their day-to-day lives. Suddenly, everything that they did felt different because Dad's not around. And in particular, the family had a cabin out. It was near where they lived. They were sort of just outside of Mount Bachelor. They had a cabin that I believe the father actually built many years ago that was tucked away like up in the foothills of Mount Bachelor. And that small cabin, it was a 2-story cabin, little log cabin. That was a place that the family often went to on the weekend for various trips they would go on. But the dad, he really loved that cabin, and he would go there all the time. It was sort of like you would never be at the cabin unless Dad was there too. So that's like Dad's place. And so the dad passes away, and so you have this really difficult dynamic now. Like their whole world has been turned upside down, and also the dad was the primary breadwinner for the family. And so now that he's gone, there wasn't a way to make ends meet for the family. I mean, he did leave behind some possessions that they'd be able to sell, but for the most part, it was suddenly financially really difficult for the family. And so, given what I just described to you about the difficult dynamic, that sudden gap in their lives, the decision really by the mother in particular, there was a decision made pretty quickly to sell the cabin because it just felt like too difficult to imagine any of them going to the cabin and actually enjoying being there, given that Dad, is not there anymore. And so this decision is made. Mom's like, we got to sell the cabin. And Nate, the 17-year-old, his experience with his dad was, he went hunting and fishing with his dad all the time. His dad was like this pseudo survivalist type guy, and he would bring his son out there to that cabin pretty much more than anybody else. It was like the son and the dad went there especially a lot. And the son understood that it makes sense to sell the cabin. He didn't disagree with the decision. However, he just sort of felt like he needed to have closure with this cabin more than his mom or his other sibling. He felt like he needed to go there at least one more time, if nothing else, to just feel close to his dad one last time. And so he asked his mom if it would be okay if he went to the cabin by himself, just spent the weekend out there. He'd bring the family dog, whose name was Midnight. He'd go out there for a weekend, and it would just give him a chance to get that closure. And his mom said, that's a great idea. If that's what you want to do, we will wait to list the property. You can go out. It's yours until we say otherwise. Stay out there for as long as you need to. And then when you come back, we'll move forward with selling the property. So Nate, that weekend, this was sometime in, I believe it was December at this point, he loads up his dad's truck that his dad had willed to him, and he brings Midnight the dog along, and Nate, he packed drinks and snacks. He brought his PlayStation along and some DVDs. Remember when DVDs were a thing? A lot of DVDs. And he took off for the cabin up at Mount Bachelor. And to sort of give you some context of where the cabin was in relationship to civilization, it wasn't so much that this cabin was super isolated and really hard to get to. It wasn't. I mean, there was a main road it wasn't lots of businesses and houses off of the main road, but there was a main road that led to where there was a side street you would take that would cut up through these tall pine trees. And, about a mile into the forest, you'd get to this property. So again, there's a major road that basically brings you there. However, these cabins that were built on Mount Bachelor were spaced really far apart. So there were other cabins, but the closest one was about a mile away. So the neighbors exist, but they're not close enough to really feel like they're actually out there. So once you're at this cabin, it really felt like you were sort of isolated. You're tucked away amongst these huge pine trees, very dense, and there's no neighbors in sight. There's a huge mountain behind you. And so you can go to the main road, go into town, do what you got to do. But as soon as you're in that cabin, it really feels like you're sort of away from the world. And that was actually part of the allure of this cabin. It really felt sort of like peace, tranquil out there. And so Nate, he drives up to the cabin, he turns off the main road, and he makes his way to this cabin. And as he was making his approach along that last stretch before he actually saw his property, it had snowed, not a lot, but there was enough snow on the ground that he was looking out ahead at the road, and he was just gauging if there were other tire tracks on this road he was on. Because before he got to his house, or his cabin, I should say, the road forked in either direction, basically turning into driveways to the other two properties that, again, are a mile away, just about on either side. So this is a mile driveway. It's not really a driveway. These are additional roads. But he's looking to see if there are tracks that would give away whether or not the other neighbors were around. Because it's the winter, and this is the time when folks would come out to their cabin and go snowboarding and skiing up on Mount Bachelor and just, be out here. But he didn't really talk to these people. So he's just looking at the road. And there's no sign that anybody has been out here. It's not a guarantee, but it looks like he's likely the only one out here, at least relative to his two closest neighbors, which, again, are miles away. For him, that was kind of great. He didn't expect to see his neighbors, but he figured the more isolation he could have, the easier it would be to sort of feel in touch with his dad. So he gets to the cabin along with his loyal dog, Midnight, and he parks the truck, he gets out. In front of this cabin, which is a 2-story cabin, there was a clearing basically to park your cars, like a little cul-de-sac in front. That's where they could park their cars. But beyond the front of the house where there was that clearing, and obviously beyond the road itself, basically every square inch was taken up with these huge pine trees, very dense forest. So he pulls into the cul-de-sac, he gets out, he takes all his stuff out of his truck, snacks, drinks, PlayStation, the DVDs, his bedding, whatever it is, and he goes inside the cabin. And the layout of the cabin is, it was pretty simple. You walked inside and there was a kitchen and there was a living room that were sort of connected to each other. There was no real wall between them. It was sort of an open floor plan. It's a pretty small cabin. So it's like one big room with windows that looked out onto that cul-de-sac from the kitchen. The kitchen was the most farthest forward room on the first floor. And then there was a second floor that you could access via a stairway in the back of the cabin from the living room that would go up to the second deck, which was a master bedroom. There was one other bedroom, a small bedroom, and the master bedroom sat sort of over the kitchen, so towards the front of the cabin. And from the master bedroom on the second floor, there was these sliding glass doors that looked out over, first of all, there was a balcony, a very small balcony just beyond those sliding glass doors. And then beyond that, you basically are looking out at the drive coming up to the property. You're looking out at that clearing, the cul-de-sac where the cars are, and then out to the forest beyond. So he goes in and gets set up, and he sets up his PlayStation in the living room. And over the next actually 48 hours, Nate had a great time. I mean, he actually expected when he got there to be sort of overcome with grief. He's in the place where everything around him reminds him of his now deceased father. But he found that it was actually really great. He did feel close to his dad. He did feel like this was a really good idea. And he also had the comfort of Midnight, his beautiful black lab. And so he has a really nice couple of days. It's snowing like crazy outside, but each of the days he was there, he was able to shovel out or basically put chains on his tires and get out to town. I'm not exactly sure how he did that, but he got out to town in the first couple of days, got food. He even went snowboarding one of the days. But for the most part, he was just hanging out at the cabin. And most of his time was spent down on the first floor in that living room near the TV. And then he would just obviously sleep upstairs in the master bedroom. But on day 3, he was supposed to be there for, I believe, 4 days, or at least 4 days. But on day 3, when he woke up on day 3, the trip started getting really weird. On day 3, he wakes up, and again, he's had 2 very nice days. And he walks into the kitchen, and he looks out the window to the front of the property, to the cul-de-sac and beyond, and he sees that even though it's been snowing over the last few days, it has snowed a lot over the night. It snowed, feet of snow have come down. And, not alarming. This makes sense for this part of the world, this time of the year. But Nate decided, you know what, I just don't have it in me to battle the weather, to battle the elements and try to go into town or try to go snowboarding. I'm just going to spend the whole day inside, hanging out, playing video games, chilling with my dog, just have a sort of lazy day at the cabin. And he wasn't upset about it. This seemed like a great thing. So he has this little morning routine, and at some point, Midnight, who, for the record, had been acting like a normal dog to this point in the entire trip. Also, for context, Midnight was a really well-trained dog. Just was an excellent dog. Was not erratic, was not crazy, did what it was told to do, very loyal. And at some point, on the morning of the 3rd day or mid-morning, Midnight began acting kind of funny. Like Midnight needed to go outside. It seemed to Nate like Midnight needed to go outside to pee. And so he just got up out of his chair in the living room and, went outside with Midnight. Now Midnight's on a leash. They go outside, it's still snowing, there's tons of snow. And Nate sort of expected that Midnight would not run off, because there's so much snow that she would likely just sort of do her business near the door and come back in. But instead, as soon as they stepped outside, Midnight didn't show any interest in wanting to go to the bathroom. Midnight instead was pulling Nate in the direction of basically towards the road that comes in, basically straight out in front of their cabin. It seemed like she was drawn in that direction. And, the snow is not like 6 feet high. It's, a couple feet of snow. He can walk through it, and he's like, okay. And so he lets, Midnight pull him forward past the truck, and he's sort of walking out to where the road is that leads back out to the main road. And it's at that point that Midnight just stops, and she's looking down the road, just staring off into oblivion here. It's broad daylight at this point. And, Nate is like, what's gotten into my dog? There's clearly she's sensed something out here, but he doesn't see any animals out here. The dog has also not reacted like this at all over the past couple of days. And he's come out here many other times with Midnight. And this is just sort of unusual behavior by Midnight. But nonetheless, he's like, come on, just like do your business. Let's go. Like, come on. And eventually Midnight would, sort of break her stare, and she would go to the bathroom. But as Nate is getting ready to pull Midnight back with him and bring her back into the cabin, he looks a little ways down the road, which he had been looking at to this point, but not critically or closely. And he sees what looks like footprints in the snow. And remember, it's been snowing quite a bit. And so if there are footprints, it needs to be relatively recent. Otherwise, they'll be covered up by the snowfall. And, right away, Nate's thinking how weird that is. There is the possibility that if there were footprints up here, one, it could totally be an animal, which would not be strange. There could be deer or moose or whatever else is in Oregon. But it also could be one of his neighbors. There were times in the past where some of these people that lived far away would just go for a walk and sometimes cut through the property line of Nate and the others. That wasn't totally unusual. But just sort of given the fact that he had come in a few days earlier and not seen any sign of anybody being at those other houses, the other cabins, and he had spent the whole day at the cabin, never heard or saw anybody, it just seemed weird that there'd be footprints out here. And so with Midnight, he sort of walks a little bit closer, just farther down towards this road to get a better look. And sure enough, there are footprints. And Midnight, as soon as they start walking in that direction, she began pulling him to go closer and closer. It seemed pretty clear that she was engaging before and now with, these footprints and whatever's out here, whatever's made them. And he gets close enough to where he can, again, clearly see there are footprints. And he sees the stride of these footprints is long enough that it could be a person. It could also be an animal. He doesn't really know. It's too deep to see the actual imprint, to see if it's, a boot or a paw print or a hoof or something. But he's just taking it all in, and he's looking at the footprints, and they sort of come out of the tree line. They haven't come up the road. They come out of the tree line and sort of pace around a little bit, sort of on the road that leads in, and then they turn and they appear to go back into the tree line. Not totally unusual, but it registers for Nate that this is a little bit odd. If that's a person, what are they doing out here? And I didn't see him, and I've been up and moving around the kitchen quite a bit, and based on the snowfall out here, there's a pretty good chance that these prints were made in the last 30 minutes, the last hour. These are recent, and I didn't see anybody. That's just weird. But Nate kind of does what I think most of us would do, which is like, there's probably some reasonable explanation for this. I'm not gonna worry about it. So he takes Midnight, who by this point really wants to go investigate these footprints and whatever's made them, but he drags Midnight back. He brings her back in the house, in the cabin. He goes inside, and now at this point he can't help but feel a little on edge, a little bit like, my privacy's been invaded by someone or something. And so he actually draws the blinds, locks the windows, locks the doors, and he's like, I'm just going to sort of cave it up for the rest of the day. I'm not going to think about what's out there. It's probably just animals or whatever. It's no big deal. So he's back in his cabin, and over the course of the afternoon, again, the windows are all drawn, and he's just sort of enjoying video games. He's sort of forgotten about the footprints. Midnight continued to act really strange. Not all day, not the entire afternoon, but periodically it was like something kept spooking her. And she kept running to the various exits of the cabin, whether it was a door or a window, and she would whimper like she really wanted to look or go outside. And Nate, a couple times he let her out to go to the bathroom, and it seemed like each time she'd be drawn to those footprints, but he wouldn't walk over there. He kind of kept her close to the cabin. But it was like all day, Midnight just could not let go of there's something out there. There's something going on that's piquing her interest. And for Nate, who admits that he considered himself a pretty tough guy, who was used to being out in the wild by himself. I mean, his mom didn't care at all that this 17-year-old kid is just, go out into the wilderness in Oregon, be out there as long as you want by yourself. It says something about his competency, at least his perceived competency. But he was pretty spooked. He was starting to feel spooked. He just felt like something weird's going on. But, he began to he continued to tell himself that it's no big deal. So that night, they're back in the cabin. Nate makes sure everything is locked, everything is shut, all the blinds are drawn, and he goes upstairs to the bedroom where he sleeps, the master bedroom that has the sliding glass doors that look out to the short balcony that looks out over the courtyard and down to the road below. And he gets in bed, and Midnight pops up on the bed with him, and they lay down, and they are about to go to sleep when Midnight really gets spooked. Like something's going on for Midnight, like more than the whole day. Something really got her attention. And she bolts downstairs to the first floor. And Nate, it's pitch black in their cabin, or close to it. They're in the middle of the woods in Oregon, very isolated. And he can hear his dog just pacing back and forth and whimpering near the door and pawing at the door. She really wants to go outside. And Nate, at this point, he is admittedly scared, and he doesn't want to go outside. He doesn't want to bring her out to pee. He doesn't want to do anything outside. He wants to stay in the house, right? But he still feels like maybe she does need to pee. And so eventually he gets up and he goes downstairs, and sure enough, Midnight is just so stressed. She wants to go outside. He puts her on a leash. He grabs, his cigarettes and his flashlight. He's like, I'm going to just be tough about this. I'm going to go out there, let her pee, come back in. He goes outside, and it's all dark, snow's falling. He's got his flashlight, he's looking around. He doesn't see anything out there, just snow everywhere, trees, snow's falling. And at midnight, doesn't want to pee. She wants to run off into the forest, and he's like holding her back. And finally, he gave up on having her pee because he just felt like she's not out here to do that. She's out here for whatever thing she's sensed out here. And so Nate's like, enough. Comes in the house, and he's like, you know what? If she needs to pee, she can pee in the house. Like, I'm not doing this. I feel unsafe being out there. I'm not doing it. Back in the house, back in the cabin, they lock the doors, they go back to the bed. And so Nate now, he can't sleep. He's just laying in bed. Midnight is like on all fours on the bed, unable to settle down. And as he's laying there trying to convince himself that, everything's okay, he hears something. And it's coming from the roof. He would describe it as what sounded like hooves walking on his roof. And there is no attic in this cabin. The roof is basically right above him. And he hears these 6 distinct steps across the roof, like someone's pacing or something, some animal, something is pacing across the roof of this cabin. And Midnight instantly is like looking up and growling. Midnight bolts off the bed. She runs over to the sliding doors that lead out to the balcony. She's trying to go out on the balcony. And Nate, he's thinking, how could anything get up there? There isn't a way to get onto the roof. There is no way. There's unless you had a ladder. And he certainly didn't have a ladder out there that led up onto the roof. This makes no sense to him. And he's also thinking if somehow there was a tree tall enough, let's just say, that overlooked the roof, that maybe an animal leapt out of onto the roof, wouldn't I have heard the impact of it striking the roof? Similarly, if somebody was climbing up a ladder, I would hear the ladder. There's no noise machine going off. There's no fan going off in his room. It's silent. But all he heard were the 6 steps. And then the steps stopped. There was no other sounds. And so at this point, Midnight is over at the sliding doors that lead out to the balcony. And, she's desperate to go out there. And Nate is sort of having this crisis. It's not that late. He has the whole night ahead of him. He feels very on edge, but he sort of feels like, I can't just pretend this is not happening. Like I'm gonna be up all night regardless, but I need to face whatever this is. It's probably just an animal. And maybe it's an animal that's stuck on the roof and it needs help getting down or something, whatever. But he sort of works himself up that he's like, I need to go out there. I need to go see what's going on. And so he gets up, he puts on his jacket. He has heard no more steps at this point. Midnight's still over at the door. The room is dark. He walks over and he slides open the curtains. And he's looking out and there's no light out there. There's a small light downstairs that kicks on with motion, but it's not on right now. It's just darkness. He can kind of make out with some moonlight some of the snow coming down, but he knows he's looking out to the front of the property, but it's dark. And then he grabs his flashlight, he's got it in hand, and he's like, all right. He opens up the sliding glass door and he steps out onto the balcony. And the first thing he does, as soon as he's out there, is he whips around and looks up at the roof behind him, because it's basically right in front of him from the balcony, and he shines his light and he's looking at the roof. And there's nothing up there. There's no animal, there's no person, there's nothing. And in fact, he can't even see any footprints, which to him was incredibly relieving. He's thinking, I'm scared, I'm making things up. There was never anything. But Midnight, meanwhile, who's right next to him on the balcony, she's now growling and she's looking out. He can kind of tell she's looking out into the darkness in front of the house. And so Nate takes his flashlight and he goes from looking up on the roof and he begins to wheel the flashlight around. And he begins to scan the tree line, which from his perspective out on this balcony, that the nearest tree line is, 30 or 40 feet away, that tree line. And he's scanning the tree line and Midnight's looking basically straight out. And so he's making his way until he's gonna see whatever she's growling at. And he eventually reaches there's this one big tree that sort of sits almost right in front of the cabin. And it's got this long branch that they call it the sitting tree, because it almost looks like there's a seat on this huge branch that's like 20 feet off the ground. And his flashlight reaches the sitting tree and he stops, because illuminated by his flashlight is this man who's crouched, almost perched on this branch. And he's got these long arms and he's gripping a branch above him. He looks like he's not wearing any clothes, he's barefoot, and his mouth is wide open and he's staring directly at Nate. And Nate, for a second, can't even process what he's seeing, but then he's suddenly so scared, his instinct is to grab Midnight, jump back inside of his house, shut the sliding doors, shut the curtains. And so he's just locked himself inside of his cabin. But as soon as he did that, he's like, oh my God, there's someone out there. I need to know what they're doing. Are they gonna come try to attack me or something? And so it's only been a couple of seconds now, and from now, inside the cabin, the glass doors are shut, he opens up the blinds, does not open the door, he opens the blinds. Now he's got glass windows and he's looking out, and he raises his flashlight and he presses it to the glass, and he shines it on the sitting tree. and there's nobody there now. And he looks all around, and there's no one. It's just darkness. It's a dark forest. No one's out there. And so now Nate does not know what to make of this because he's heard footsteps on the roof. Impossible footsteps. He saw the footsteps yesterday that didn't really make any sense. His dog's been acting funny. This guy, whatever this is, he described it as being so tall, long, skinny, tall, gray-looking figure, clearly is out here, or I'm losing my mind. And so his decision was, I'm just gonna stay awake all night, be vigilant, and wait this thing out, and tomorrow morning, as soon as the sun comes up, I'm out of here. And so he did a pass all through his house to ensure all the doors are locked, all the windows are locked, drew all the curtains, and then he and Midnight hopped on the bed in the master bedroom and just prepared to wait, because at this point, he doesn't feel like it's safe to go to sleep. And so he's sitting in bed. Midnight is totally on edge, but she's gone from being angry, like wanting to attack, to now being a little bit scared herself. And she's tucking up against Nate on the bed. And after about 30 minutes, something downstairs gets Midnight's attention. Midnight leaps off the bed, but instead of running down the stairs, she runs to the top of the stairs. And now she's basically looking down to the first floor. Nate's on the bed. He's looking over at Midnight. And then Nate hears a tapping sound on his front door downstairs, almost like someone's tapping the door with their finger over and over again. And then it stops. And then Midnight sprints downstairs. And for a minute, Nate's like, what do I do? I mean, is that guy down there now? I have no idea what to do in this situation, so he just waits. And Midnight, she's pacing around, and eventually she calms down, and she comes back upstairs. There's no more tapping. And so Nate, his heart's racing. He's thinking, like, is this the same guy? What is this thing? Who is this thing? Who is this? A minute later, he hears more tapping, but now it's not coming from the first floor front door. It's coming from the side. He had a bathroom just off the master bedroom, and there's a little sliver of glass that looks into the bathroom. And he can distinctly hear, even though he didn't hear any sounds of someone climbing the exterior of their cabin, which would be required to get to this, something is tapping on the small pane of glass, looking into the window right behind him. Nate's horrified. The tapping goes on for a bit. Midnight at this point is spooked. She's tucked up against him. She's just looking into the bathroom. The tapping stops. Then there's more tapping on the other side of the cabin. And for about an hour or so, this is how it went, all around the house. Just periodic tapping, all the different windows, the doors, the walls. There was no sound leading up to the tapping. It would just start somewhere around the cabin. It was absolutely terrifying. And then at a certain point, somewhere around 2, 3 in the morning, he heard the sound of footsteps out on the balcony. And then the tapping began on the glass of the sliding glass doors, 6, 10 feet away from him and Midnight. And all night, for the rest of the night, just sporadic tapping on that door. Until finally, the sun came up and the tapping stopped. And at that point, Nate is desperate to get out of here. He's so scared. But the sun is up now, the blinds are all drawn. He hasn't heard tapping in some time. And he goes over and he opens up the blinds and he looks out onto the balcony. And there's all these hoof prints all over the front balcony. And he steps out onto the balcony and he looks down, and it's an unbelievable sea of hoof prints all around the house. There's a racetrack around the house. He turns, looks onto his roof. There's all sorts of hoof prints on his roof. They are everywhere. And so Nate grabs his dog, grabs his stuff, jumps in his car, speeds home, and could not have been happier that they sold that place within the next month or so, because he was never going to go back. And he has no idea what it was. So that's the story. I think it's called Who Was Knocking? So there you go. What do you think? What do you think of that? That was a pretty good rendition. All righty. Well, unfortunately, the chat is sort of delayed, so I can't really get your live reactions. Let's see. It was Santa and his reindeer. Yeah, probably. Probably. I don't know what to make of stories like that, because I think that in a situation where you're out in the woods by yourself, even if you're like a survivalist or something, I think it'd be easy to work yourself up and get scared. However, make sense of all the hoof prints around the house? I don't know. Pretty good. So on that note, remember we have a cool thing coming out here. Stick around for the big announcement, okay? But I think now is a good time to reference that this graphic novel, while it does not necessarily include that particular story, it does have 9 stories in it. It's an anthology of stories that are sort of along the same lines, beautifully brought to life with illustrations by Andrea Muti, okay? And I want to tell you that actually right now, why don't we do this right now? Throw the graphic up you can still get yourself a signed copy of Where Nightmares Live. If you go to book.ballenstudios.com, you're going to land on this page here at Premier Collectibles and Books A Million. You can get yourself a signed bookplate copy by yours truly. Pretty cool, okay? And actually, if you go to the next graphic here on that same website, book.ballenstudios.com, if you scroll down, those are the other places you can purchase said book, Where Nightmares Live. Those are not of the signed variety. So if you want to do that, you should. It's pretty good. If you like that story, we got 9 more in the same vein. And while we're on the topic of selling things, get yourself a seasonal official MrBallen flannel. There it is. If you go to shopmrballen.com, thanks for putting the sign out there so I remember the URL. Shopmrballen.com, get yourself one of these sweet flannels. 20% off. What a deal. Shopmrballen.com, get yourself a flannel. So, what we're going to do is we have a little bit of time. Don't worry if you're sticking around for the big announcement, it's coming. But first, we're going to do a little Q&A. So why don't you all fire off your questions in the chat? I'll do my best to read them. It kind of flies through. But while you all populate some questions in the chat, I'm going to take a few questions from our Discord server. Shout out to all the members of our Discord server. If you don't know what that is, well, it's pretty cool. We have this server with like over 100,000 people in it. It's free to join. It's like a big internet hangout spot. It's like the town square for the strange, dark, and mysterious. I'm pretty sure there are links in my bio. It's free to join. I think you can probably just Google like Discord MrBallen, it'll bring you to it. But anyways, these are some questions from Discord, and then I'm going to grab some from here as well. First question. If your life was ever turned into a movie, who would you want to play you? You know what's funny? I don't even know why I just thought of this. I haven't read these questions yet. This is off the cuff, so this is not a staged answer. I don't know if you guys are big fans of Daniel Tosh, the comedian, or not. He shares no likeness with me. We are in no way similar. But I think he's hilarious, and he's... he would not... I don't think he'd do a good job representing me, but he'd be really funny. He's like my favorite celebrity. He also notoriously doesn't do like any public appearances. He doesn't interact with anybody. He's like really private, and I think it'd be cool to have Daniel Tosh play me. Are you coming to the UK? From Trill1701. I think eventually, yeah. So this year, unfortunately, we could not swing a live tour, which frankly was crushing. But we will definitely do more live events, not just live streams, but live in-person events. It was really, really cool doing that last year. We went on, actually, real quick, who went to one of the 15 live shows in 2024? That was a good time. Let us know in the chat. Or the one in 2023 in Austin. There was another one we did. But I think that eventually we could go to the UK, for sure. Do some storytelling. I love doing the live stuff. Here's a question. Do you sleepwalk every night? Not every night, but pretty close. There's I believe I have a combination of nightmare syndrome that I've had since before the military, so it's not like I did Town Hall in New York City, nice. Some folks were at, you were at the one in Charlotte, very nice. Crystal Capone 2243. Nightmare syndrome is exactly what it sounds like. You literally just have these visceral, awful nightmares. I started having like sleepwalking episodes when I was 18 in college. My first one, I guess now I think the statute of limitations has passed, so I won't get in trouble. But when I was in college, my first semester in college, I think it was that while it was, yeah, I think it was my first semester in college. I was at UMass Amherst. Anybody attend the University of Massachusetts in beautiful Amherst, Mass? UMass Amherst. I was asleep in my dorm in the John Quincy Adams dorm. It's like this huge high-rise dorm. It's like 24 stories. And I went to bed and I suddenly woke up, and I have this weird. If you've not sleepwalked, it's hard to put this in perspective. But basically, when you're sleepwalking, you're sort of aware that something's not quite right. Like, you're not quite normal, but you can't help but feel all the fear or anxiety that's associated with whatever dream or experience you're having in your sort of dreaming state. You're sort of really caught between reality and dreams. And so I have this moment where I'm sort of vaguely aware that I'm standing in the hallway of my dorm on the 20th or 19th floor or something. And I also look down at my hand, and I notice that it's sort of bloodied, like I punched something. At least that's what it looks like. And I also glance up and I notice that there's a fire alarm that's right in front of me on the wall, and there's there's a plastic cover, that's designed to sort of be there so you don't accidentally pull it. You lift it up and pull the fire alarm, and it's been broken. It looks like it's been impacted by something, and I'm sort of putting together that this doesn't feel right, like maybe I did this. And then I sort of take stock of the fact that the alarm's going off in the dorm. And so I run to the stairwell, and there's all these people evacuating. No one's panicked. It's college kids. And we walk down like 19 floors of stairs, and then I go outside, and it's raining, and everybody basically congregated in like right outside the front doors because it was raining. But I like walked outside, and I don't know, I must have been sleepwalking. And I like wandered away from the group and slowly came to realize I was only wearing shorts, and it's like cold, it's raining, I'm just wearing shorts. And I walk to this puddle, and I'm like looking at my hand, and I'm standing in this puddle. It's like ankle deep, and I'm like dipping my knuckle in the water for a while until it sort of like dawned on me that I was sort of sleepwalking. And then I ran back to the group and pretended I was acting normally. But I don't have proof of this, but I'm reasonably certain I pulled that fire alarm in my sleepwalking state. But that was in 2018. That was not 2018. My God, that was in 2006. So, but anyhow, do I sleepwalk every night? No. But nightmare syndrome is a thing. You basically have nightmares. And then I have this thing that I believe I have. I've done sleep studies. No one can quite pin it down. It's called non-REM. Oh, what the heck is it called? Disturbance something or other. Basically, when I'm not in REM, I basically stay in deep sleep so long, and then I like have a hard time coming out of it. Anyways, I'm just a mess. So a lot of times I sleepwalk. A lot of times. I sleptwalk once. It's unreal. From Nixon 7310. It's weird. A lot of my sleepwalking is me leaping out of my bed and running as fast. I sleep alone because of this, because I'm a horrible sleep partner. Shout out to my wife, Amanda, who puts up with it, or she did for the first decade of our marriage. Now I sleep alone. I run out of the room screaming profanities, usually at the absolute top of my lungs, because I believe someone's going to kill me. And then I sort of like come to, my wife's like, go to bed. Lovingly, she says that. So yeah. All right, I told you guys to put questions in here, and I've done a horror. What happened to your neck? From Chickswin. Chicks, WNN. What happened to your neck? Here, let's do this. And I'm not insulting you, Chickswin, but I've tried so hard to cover this. Would someone, or would you all like to put in the comments what's wrong with my neck? Let's see how many people have taken the many times I've tried to address it. Basically, I do an exercise in the gym that cuts it, and I keep doing the exercise because you got to keep going. You got to stay disciplined. And I cut my collarbone every single time. Kiara, Keara, K.E.A.R.A. What's my go-to coffee order? Honestly, I just do black, venti, no ice, but iced coffee from Starbucks. So iced, black, no ice from Starbucks. And you know what I actually do? I buy them sort of in bulk. I get 6 coffees like that, and I put them in my fridge. And then every day, I get a nice, fresh, iced black coffee. All right, let's see. A couple more questions. We got plenty of time. Kathleen Niece, 1217. What's your favorite horror movie? So me and my children, I don't know if this is age appropriate or not for my kids, but we watched Signs recently by Mel Gibson. That scared the heck out of me when I was a kid. Honestly, it was just that scene with the alien walking past the alleyway at the kid's birthday party. Horrifying. And also, Joaquin Phoenix is such a good actor. It's just, I'll watch him in anything. So we watched that. That's one of my favorites. And we watched Paranormal Activity 1 and Paranormal Activity 2. Those are great films, too. I think the first one was better, though, because it sort of set the genre in motion, sort of. Although that didn't really set the genre. I think Blair Witch Project did the found footage thing first. But I'd say Signs. I don't know if it counts as horror, but I'd say Signs. That's probably it. Navy Aviator just said, I'd be willing to argue that by the 6th cup of coffee I've put in the fridge that it's no longer fresh. I disagree, because I drink too much coffee and I fly through them. So it's like within a couple of days I'm hitting number 6. Grant Kelly 7490, are you sober? I am. I am sober as of May 5th, 2024. I've always struggled with substance abuse, namely alcohol. But the way I would struggle with it is I would convince myself I had no issues with it and have periods of my life where I would ruthlessly binge drink by myself, often at night. I would like hide. My go-to actually became, well, I'm not advocating for this in the least, but it was like those seltzers, those hard seltzers, because they didn't give me a hangover and I could drink them really fast. And I would like sneak into my garage at night and like drink 6 or 8 or 10 as fast as I could and then like go to bed. I don't even know why I did that. But it became like I had to do it. And then my wife would catch me. And then I would tell her, oh my God, I'll never do it again. And I would do it again. And I genuinely, it wasn't like I'm a bad person. I just couldn't not do it. I would go through months. At one point I did a whole year where I didn't touch anything, but I would always just fall back into it because I'd have like a good run in my life. I'd be like hitting all my responsibilities and like just being like good in every way that I deemed good. And I'm gonna reward myself. I'm gonna get drunk by myself in my garage with when all the kids and my wife is asleep. It's a bad setup. Doesn't really. Oh man, it was awful. It got so bad that in May of 2024. I did sort of feel like if I didn't clean up my act, one, the health issues for me would be pretty real. Also, trivia, if you look at some of the older videos of mine on YouTube, I gotta say, I'm hungover in a lot of those videos. So it was just taking over my life. But I felt like it was gonna ruin my marriage to Amanda. You know, we got married in 2011. We got 3 kids together, but you know, it was like 6 times or something that I got so bad, and then she caught me after I promised I wouldn't do it again. It's that cycle of lying. Even though my intentions were good, the lying is just, it's tough on a marriage when it feels like you don't have trust. Even though I really believe that addiction is like a disease, and at a certain point, I wasn't choosing to harm my wife. I was just doing the thing I was addicted to, which was like binge drinking alcohol more than anything else. So I have stopped. I got to be honest. I did do AA for a time. I did it in Texas for a little while. I did it in Jersey as well. And then I did it. And so I'm laughing because I probably should have kept it up, but I ended up not doing it anymore. I don't know. I didn't really work great for me. I felt like I just felt ready to stop, I suppose. And also, it was just eating up a lot of my time to go to the meetings. I know that sounds horrible, but in the spirit of transparency, that's sort of the reality. But now, like, I look at this platform I have as like a place where I'm being held accountable every day. because I made it a thing that I'm sober. And I don't judge in the least anybody who's not sober. But I'll tell you, if you have an issue, and you probably know you do, sobriety, it sucks at first, but you quickly realize that the things that you would, when you're in the middle of abusing substances, you view things like sitting on the couch and watching a show like with your kids, it would be kind of boring. I hate to say that, but it's true. But when you remove the substances and it's out of your system, you actually, the way you react to things totally changes. You start getting like dopamine rushes from things that are ordinary and like good. Like hanging with your kids suddenly is honest to God enjoyable, and like you want to do it, you want to be there, you want to be present. It applies to everything. Like it reshuffles the way you are made happy. And then once you're there, it's easy to maintain it. It's just hard to get there, of course. So shout out to those struggling with that. I know it's hard. It took me years and years and years. I think this is the final time. I believe it is. So, all right. Let's see. We have a few minutes left. I'll do one more question. I'll take one from Discord, so you can stop pummeling the chat with questions. Number 14 was, it's after all the stories you've researched over the years, have they had any effect on your beliefs? I wish I knew who asked that question. So if you asked that question, it's a great question. The truth is, I've always been really open and interested in the strange, dark, and mysterious. This channel certainly did not come to be because I was like, I'm going to make a YouTube channel. It was a byproduct of already being really genuinely interested in this genre. I find the world's mysteries to be fascinating, like especially like kind of scary stuff. But so the reason I say that is I think I was more tempted to believe things at the beginning of doing MrBallen. Like this started really in earnest in 2020. Now, as a result of having researched and read through and just read so much and researched so much, you realize that there really aren't a huge number of like highly credible, not paranormal, but like weird happenings. There definitely are those that have happened. We tell as many as we can on the channel and on the podcast, but there's so many stories that are fabricated online, maybe with good intentions, maybe with not. And I think that having a keen eye for not wanting to believe. Now, with that said, there's like a gray area, and we'll often sort of live in this gray area, which is you get somebody's point of view. Like you speak to somebody like Nate, that's not really his name, but when I spoke to him, like that was his perspective. That's what he saw. That's what he experienced. Whether or not it happened exactly the way he recalls, or whether or not my rendition holds up to what he actually saw, is secondary to the fact that in his life, he had an experience that was like that. That's what it was. It could have been something that was totally benign, but we don't have that information. All we have is his testimony. And so if you take it as a story and you take it as that's what he thinks he saw and felt and witnessed, then that's what it is, and it's great. But if you start getting into like, what do I believe in, like in terms of paranormal or in terms of this, I think I'm much more skeptical as a result of all the research, but still very open-minded. There was a channel that I used to love that's called, and they actually might still be around. I think they changed a lot, but it's called Dark 5, the number 5. There's no audio. It's just this creator would find the craziest like world mysteries. You should still check them out. I hope they're still on there. And they just would have a couple of sentences they would put on the screen. They'd like play the video. The video is like 3 minutes long. And it would be like a slideshow of these fascinating images, these horrifying images with like little bullets that sort of gave context to the pictures. And I would go down these crazy rabbit holes, and I thought they were so cool. I'll say Dark 5, I'm just promoting them because I think they're great. They will talk about stuff that is, in my mind, a lot of it's pretty credible. So if there was a place that you wanted to go and I'm not giving an endorsement to all their content, but a lot of the stuff they cover on Dark 5, it's like, look into it yourself. There's some validity to it. Rob Gavigan, yeah, I love that guy. He was one of my favorite channels. Mr. Nightmare, love Mr. Nightmare. Anyhow, okay, so here we go. We're gonna go to the big announcement that you've all patiently waited for. So, Again, this is shout out to Antonio, who came up with this brilliant plan here. So what we're going to do is over the next 2 weeks, this is going to be starting tomorrow. And for those that don't know, if you just joined late, I said there was going to be a game that we're going to announce here that's going to play out over the next 2 weeks. Here's the game. We are going to be hiding copies of the new graphic novel, Where Nightmares Live, that will have a special customized inscription and signature from me on the book. You'll definitely know if you found one of the hidden books. We're going to hide them all over the country. We're going to hide one a day starting tomorrow. So on Halloween, that's the first book that's going to get hidden. And the way it's going to go is over the next 2 weeks, every day at 2 p.m. Eastern, give or take, we're going to drop a clue as to where that day's book has been hidden. They are not all going to be hid in bookstores. Some will. But some will be hid in, appropriate, spooky places. Nothing that's unsafe. Don't worry, kids. I think it's safe to say kids can take part in this. This will not be dangerous, other than maybe you need to go into some spooky graveyard or something. But each day, keep in mind, we only will know if you found it if you document it. So we're basically hoping that with each person who finds a book, we did this the last couple of days we were doing this, and people did respond this way. Take a picture of the inscription, because it's a unique inscription inside the book. Also, the book is yours to take, of course. You don't have to do anything. It's yours to take. Take a picture. You don't got to be in the picture. If you want to take a video, if you want to be in, great. Send it to me or tag me, but in some way, get it to the MrBallen Instagram account. We are on the lookout for these videos and pictures, and then I will interact with you, congratulate you, and make you feel great about your big find, talk to you a little bit, and we'll put you on social media. So it's going to be a scavenger hunt every day for the next 2 weeks, starting tomorrow. Is a clue coming out today, though?
No, announcing today.
The first clue is tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern, and then every subsequent day, 2 p.m. Eastern. On the morning of August 23rd, 1973, a 23-year-old bank clerk named Kristen Enmark arrived at the Credit Banken in Stockholm, Sweden. The air was crisp, and the city was just beginning to stir with the energy of a late summer Thursday. Kristen liked her job because it was stable and prestigious. She spent her days handling paperwork and helping customers in a lobby that felt like a fortress of modern civilization. There was a sense of order there that made the idea of violence feel like something that only happened in other countries or in the movies. As she settled behind her counter, the routine was exactly what she expected. People were lining up to make deposits, the tellers were counting out krona, and the heavy glass doors were swinging open and shut as the morning rush intensified. But at precisely 10 past 10, that order was violently ripped apart. A man wearing a theatrical wig, dark glasses, and heavy makeup burst through the front entrance. He wasn't just holding a gun, he was carrying a submachine gun. He fired a burst into the ceiling, the deafening cracks echoing off the marble walls like thunder trapped in a box. The man was Jan Erik Olsen, a career criminal who had just walked out of prison on a furlough and decided he wasn't going back. He shouted in English, "The party has only just begun," and ordered everyone to the floor. The lobby, which had been a place of calm business seconds ago, became a scene of pure chaos. Kristen felt her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she could barely breathe. Her legs went weak, and she collapsed to the floor. Her cheek pressed against the cold stone as she watched the boots of the gunmen pacing back and forth near the teller stations. Olsen wasn't there for a quick grab and dash. He had a list of demands. He wanted 3 million Swedish krona, a fast getaway car, and most importantly, he wanted the police to bring his former cellmate, a notorious bank robber named Clark Olofsson, to the bank to join him. To the surprise of everyone, the Swedish authorities actually agreed. They hoped that by bringing in a second criminal who was supposedly more rational, they could negotiate a peaceful end to the crisis. Instead, the two men herded Kristen and 3 of her coworkers into the bank's massive main vault. The door to the vault was a masterpiece of engineering, a thick slab of steel and concrete designed to keep the world out. When Olsen swung it shut and the heavy bolts clicked into place, the sound was final. Inside, the air was immediately different. It was heavy still and smelled of old paper and ozone. Kristen sat on the floor, her back against a row of safety deposit boxes, watching the two men who now held her life in their hands. She waited for the cruelty to begin. She waited for them to start hurting her or using her as a shield, but that isn't what happened. Over the next few hours, a strange atmosphere began to settle in the vault. Instead of acting like a monster, Olsen started talking to the hostages. When Kristen began to shiver from the cold of the air conditioning, Olsen took off his own jacket and draped it over her shoulders. When another hostage, a woman named Brigitte, mentioned that she was worried about her family, the gunman spoke to her with genuine empathy, telling her they would make sure she got back to them. They shared their food and their water, treating the 4 bank employees more like teammates than captives. By the second day, a terrifying shift occurred in Kristen's mind. Outside the vault, the police were getting aggressive. They were shouting threats through the door, cutting off the electricity, and eventually they started drilling holes through the concrete ceiling to drop in microphones and cameras. To the world outside the police were the heroes trying to save the victims. But inside the vault, the perspective was inverted. The police were the ones causing the noise, the darkness, and the fear. The gunmen, meanwhile, were the ones offering coats, food, and a sense of calm. Kristen found herself looking at Clark Olofsson not as a criminal, but as a protector. She began to believe that the only reason they were in danger was because the police wouldn't just let them all drive away together. The psychological pressure of being trapped in that small, lightless space began to fuse the hostages and the captors into a single unit. When the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme actually called the vault to speak with the hostages, he expected to hear desperate pleas for rescue. Instead, he got a 23-year-old girl who was furious with him. Kristen told the Prime Minister over the phone that she was fully satisfied with the robbers. She begged him to let her leave the bank with the gunmen in the getaway car, promising that they wouldn't hurt her. She told the leader of the country that she was not afraid of the men with the guns, but she was terrified that the police were going to attack and kill everyone inside. The Prime Minister was stunned. He was listening to a victim defend her victimizer with a level of passion that defied all logic. It was as if she had been brainwashed in a matter of 48 hours. On the 6th day, the authorities decided they had waited long enough. They pumped tear gas through the holes in the ceiling. The vault became a choking, blinding nightmare. But even then, the bond held. The hostages didn't run toward the door when the police finally forced it open. They stayed with the gunmen. When the police ordered the criminals to come out first, the hostages refused. They knew that if the gunmen walked out alone, the snipers outside would likely open fire. To prevent this, the hostages formed a human circle around Olsen and Olofsson. They shielded the men who had kidnapped them, walking out of the bank in a tight group to ensure their captors made it to the police vans alive. As Kristen was being placed onto a stretcher to be taken to the hospital, she caught Clark Olofsson's eye. She didn't look at him with relief that he was being arrested. She reached out and shook his hand, her eyes filled with tears as she told him she would see him again. It was a scene that left the gathered crowd and the international media in a state of total disbelief. They had just witnessed the birth of something new. Psychiatrists who studied the case later coined the term Stockholm Syndrome to describe this exact phenomenon, a survival mechanism where a victim under extreme stress and isolation begins to identify with their captor as a way to cope with the trauma. For Kristen and the others, the gunmen were the ones who allowed them to live every hour, while the police were the ones who threatened that life with gas and drills. It was a chilling reminder of how easily the human mind can be rewired when the walls close in and the only hand offered is the one holding the gun. Even years later, the hostages refused to testify against the men, and some even visited them in prison. They remained convinced that the only people who truly understood them during those 6 days were the men inside that vault. That psychological bond, forged in the darkness and the dust of a bank lobby, would eventually become a standard part of hostage negotiations worldwide. But as strange as that mental shift was, it was far from the only time a voice and a little bit of trust were used to completely dismantle the security of a major financial institution. While Kristen Enmark was defending her captors in Sweden halfway across the world in the bustling heart of India, another bank official was about to prove that you don't even need a gun to walk out of a vault with a fortune. All it takes is a familiar voice on the other end of a crackling telephone line and a belief that you are serving a higher purpose. For a man named Ved Prakash Malhotra, the danger wouldn't come from a masked man with a submachine gun, but from the terrifying realization that his own loyalty had been weaponized against him. At precisely 11:15 in the morning on May 24th, 1971, in the heart of New Delhi, India, a man named Ved Prakash Malhotra was sitting at his mahogany desk inside the State Bank of India. The air outside was thick with the oppressive dry heat of an Indian summer, but inside the bank's main branch on Parliament Street, the high ceilings and thick stone walls kept the air surprisingly cool and still. Malhotra was the chief cashier, a position he had earned through decades of meticulous, flawless service. He was a man who took immense pride in his ironclad adherence to protocol. He was 50-something with graying hair and a posture that still carried the rigid discipline of his younger years. To Malhotra, the bank was more than just a place of business. It was a cathedral of financial stability for the entire nation of India. His morning had been entirely unremarkable up until that point. He had been reviewing ledger entries and overseeing the distribution of currency to various tellers. The familiar sounds of the bank, the rhythmic thumping of rubber stamps, the low murmur of clerks, and the occasional heavy clack of a typewriter created a soothing background noise. This was his world, and in his world, everything always followed a very specific, predictable set of rules. As he reached for a file, the telephone on his desk began to ring. This was his direct line, a number only a handful of senior officials possessed. Malhotra adjusted his glasses and picked up the receiver, expecting a routine inquiry from the head office. But the moment he spoke and heard the voice on the other end, his entire body stiffened. His breath hitched in his throat, and his hand tightened around the plastic receiver until his knuckles turned white. The voice was commanding, sharp, and instantly recognizable to anyone living in India at the time. It was the voice of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She told Malhotra that a top-secret mission of national importance was currently underway related to the ongoing crisis in East Bengal. She explained that she needed 6 million rupees in cash immediately to be delivered to a special courier for a clandestine operation. Malhotra's mind raced. This was a flagrant violation of every bank policy he had ever sworn to protect. Normally, such a withdrawal would require stacks of paperwork, multiple signatures, and days of processing. But this was the Prime Minister herself speaking to him. She sounded urgent, even a bit stressed, which made the request feel incredibly real. She told him that the secret courier would meet him in a few minutes at a nearby location with the proper code. The voice on the line then switched to that of P.N. Haksar, the Prime Minister's highly influential principal secretary. He reinforced the instructions, telling Malhotra that he must act with absolute discretion and speed. Haksar's voice was equally familiar, carrying the weight of the Prime Minister's office. Malhotra felt a surge of patriotic duty. He believed he was being trusted by the highest level of government with the safety of the country itself. He hung up the phone, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. His mouth felt suddenly dry, and a fine sheen of cold sweat began to break out on his forehead. He didn't stop to consult his superiors or verify the call through official channels. He couldn't risk sabotaging a secret state mission. He moved with a frantic, purposeful energy that startled his subordinates as he made his way toward the main currency vault. Malhotra used his master keys to open the heavy steel doors of the vault. Inside, the stacks of 100-rupee notes looked like bricks of solid gold under the dim lights. He began grabbing bundles, his fingers trembling as he stuffed them into large, heavy canvas bags. He didn't count the money twice. He simply relied on the pre-measured stacks. To the other clerks watching, he looked like a man possessed, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a terrifying intensity. Once he had the 6 million rupees, an astronomical sum in 1971, he lugged the heavy bags to his car. He drove through the chaotic, honking traffic of New Delhi toward a prearranged spot on Upper Ridge Road. Every time he stopped at a red light, he glanced nervously at the bags in the passenger seat, half expecting a police officer to pull him over. But the world outside his car seemed completely oblivious to the massive heist he was facilitating. He arrived at the designated street corner and saw a tall, well-built man standing alone near a cluster of trees. This was Rustam Nagarwala, a former captain in the Indian Army and a man with a decorated, albeit shadowy, military past. Malhotra pulled over and stepped out of the car, his legs feeling like lead. He approached the man and uttered the secret code word the voice on the phone had given him. Nagarwala nodded and repeated the countersign.
The exchange was over in less than 2 minutes. Malhotra helped Nagarwala load the heavy bags of cash into a waiting taxi. As the taxi pulled away, disappearing into the haze of dust and exhaust, Malhotra felt a brief moment of immense relief. He had completed his mission. He had served his prime minister. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, wiping his brow with a handkerchief, waiting for his racing heart to finally slow down to a normal rhythm. According to his instructions, Malhotra then drove directly to the prime minister's official residence to pick up the formal receipt for the money. He expected to be greeted by security and ushered into a private office where he would be thanked for his service. But when he arrived at the gate and explained his situation to the guards, they looked at him with utter confusion. They told him that the prime minister was in a meeting and had issued no such orders. Malhotra felt a cold, sickening sensation wash over him, starting at the base of his neck and spreading down to his fingertips. He insisted on speaking with PN Haksar, but when the secretary eventually appeared, he denied ever making a phone call to the bank. The realization hit Malhotra like a physical blow to the stomach. There was no secret mission, there was no relief fund. He had been tricked into handing over 6 million rupees to a complete stranger. He rushed to the local police station, his voice cracking, as he tried to explain the bizarre sequence of events. The police were initially incredulous, but the sheer scale of the theft forced them into immediate action. They launched a massive manhunt across the city, and to their surprise, they found Rustam Nagarwala at a local hotel within just a few hours. He still had the majority of the cash with him, packed into his luggage as if he were preparing to flee. Nagarwala was arrested and taken into custody, where he reportedly confessed to the crime almost immediately. He claimed that he had used his skills in vocal mimicry, a talent he had honed during his years in military intelligence, to imitate the voices of both Indira Gandhi and PN Haksar. He told investigators that it was a solo operation, a daring prank, to see if he could actually pull off such a massive deception using nothing but a telephone and a confident tone. The case seemed open and shut, but as the investigation deepened, things began to take a much darker and more suspicious turn. People began to ask how a lone man could know the exact internal bank protocols, Malhotra's direct line, and the political climate well enough to make the scam believable. Rumors began to swirl that Nagarwala wasn't a lone wolf, but a scapegoat for a botched intelligence operation involving the Prime Minister's own secret funds. The suspicion reached a fever pitch during the legal proceedings. Nagarwala's trial was conducted with unprecedented speed, almost as if the state wanted the matter settled and forgotten as quickly as possible. But the real shock came when the lead police investigator on the case, a man named D.K. Kashyap, died in a violent head-on car collision while traveling on a clear, open road. There were no witnesses, and the circumstances of the crash were never fully explained. Not long after the investigator's death, Rustam Nagarwala himself began to fall ill in prison. He complained of chest pains and was moved to a hospital under heavy guard. Despite being a relatively young and healthy man, he died suddenly of a supposed heart attack before he could testify in a more public inquiry. His death ensured that his side of the story would stay buried forever. The 6 million rupees were recovered, but the truth behind the voice had vanished. Ved Prakash Malhotra's life was completely ruined. He was dismissed from the bank in disgrace, his reputation as a man of rules shattered by a few minutes of psychological manipulation. He spent the rest of his years as a recluse, haunted by the memory of that commanding voice on the telephone. He could never quite reconcile the voice he heard with the man who was arrested, leaving a lingering doubt about who was truly on the other end of the line. The bank vault on Parliament Street remains its stone walls still holding the echoes of that strange May morning. It stands as a monument to the fact that the most sophisticated security systems in the world are only as strong as the human beings who run them. A single voice tailored to hit the right note of authority and fear can bypass every lock and key ever made. It's a chilling thought that lingers long after the sun sets over the dusty streets of New Delhi. But while a voice can be used to steal a fortune, sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones that never make a sound at all. In the damp gray forests of northern France, a different kind of predator was learning to wait in the silence of the trees. He wasn't interested in money or political power. He was interested in the lonely paths that led away from the railway stations, where the only sound you would hear is the soft click of a rifle being loaded. At approximately 7:15 on a Tuesday evening in late November of 1973, a 24-year-old woman named Elodie was leaning her forehead against the cool glass window of a commuter train. Outside the French countryside was nothing but a blur of dark shapes and the occasional flicker of a distant farmhouse light. Elodie had just finished a long, exhausting shift at a department store in Paris and was looking forward to nothing more than a hot meal and the comfort of her own bed in the quiet town of Nogent-sur-Oise. The train car was mostly empty, filled only with the rhythmic clicking of the wheels against the iron rails and the soft hum of the heater beneath her seat. For Elodie, this nightly commute was her sanctuary. It was a time to decompress and transition from the frantic energy of the city to the peaceful silence of the Oise region. She knew every curve in the track and every station along the way. To her, this journey was the very definition of safe. It was a routine she had performed hundreds of times without a single moment of worry. As the train slowed down and pulled into her small rural station, the hydraulic doors opened with a long, lonely hiss. Elodie stepped out onto the gravel platform, the biting autumn air immediately catching in her throat. The station was almost completely unlit, save for one flickering bulb near the ticket office that cast long dancing shadows across the tracks. She watched as the train pulled away, its red taillights fading into the thick evening fog, until she was left standing there in total silence. She adjusted the strap of her bag and began the 10-minute walk toward her village. The path was a narrow dirt road that ran alongside a high railway embankment bordered on one side by dense brush and towering trees. It was a walk she usually enjoyed, but tonight, something felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. As her boots crunched on the wet gravel, she suddenly felt a prickle of unease at the base of her neck. It was that inexplicable sensation of being watched by someone hidden in the darkness. She stopped for a second, her breath hitching in her chest, and listened. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her own heart thumping against her ribs. But then she heard it. A faint metallic rustle coming from the thick brush at the top of the embankment. She turned her head toward the sound, squinting into the shadows. For a split second, the moonlight caught a small, steady reflection, something hard and metallic, positioned perfectly in the crook of a tree branch. It looked like the glint of a camera lens, or perhaps something much more lethal. Elodie didn't wait to find out. A surge of adrenaline hit her system, making her legs feel light and shaky. She didn't look back again. She simply began to run. She sprinted toward the distant lights of the village, her lungs burning in the cold air and her vision blurring with tears of pure terror. She made it to her front door, fumbled with her keys, and practically fell inside, locking every bolt behind her. She told herself it was just her imagination, that the stress of the city was finally getting to her. But what Elodie didn't know was that she had just narrowly escaped becoming another entry in a terrifying tally. For the past several years, the Oise department had been gripped by a fear that was slowly paralyzing every small town in the region. A faceless predator had been haunting the transit network, earning him the chilling nickname of the railway sniper. He didn't hunt in the city, and he didn't target people in groups. He waited for the lone women who relied on those late evening trains to get home. The pattern was as precise as it was terrifying. A woman would step off a train, begin her walk home, and simply never arrive. There was no struggle, no robbery, and no obvious motive. The victims were always found near the railway embankments, killed by a single perfectly placed shot from a .22 caliber rifle. The killer was a ghost. He left no footprints, no DNA, and no witnesses. He seemed to have an intimate knowledge of the landscape, knowing exactly where the shadows were deepest and where the police patrols were the thinnest. By the time 1974 arrived, the French National Police had assembled a specialized task force to hunt the sniper. They were under immense pressure as the body count continued to rise. The investigators were dealing with a level of precision they had never seen before in a civilian case. The shots were taken from distances that required professional marksmanship. This wasn't a crime of passion or a disorganized drifter. This was someone who treated human hunting like a clinical technical exercise, someone who understood ballistics and camouflage. The police began to saturate the railway lines with undercover officers, hoping to bait the killer into making a mistake. They used female officers dressed as commuters walking the dark paths alone, while snipers of their own watched from the rooftops. But the railway sniper was patient. He seemed to sense the trap disappearing for months at a time, only to strike again in a completely different village. He was playing a high-stakes cat-and-mouse game with the authorities, and for a long time he was winning every single round. The breakthrough didn't come from a dramatic shootout or a lucky tip. It came from the tedious, grinding work of geographic mapping. Two young investigators decided to plot every single murder on a massive map of the Oise region. They didn't just look at where the bodies were found, they looked at the timing of the attacks and the proximity to local factories and businesses. They were looking for a life that intersected with the railway at just the right moments. They began to realize that the killings weren't random. They followed a very specific commuter path. As they narrowed their search, one name kept appearing on the periphery of their investigation. Marcel Barbeau was a 34-year-old family man living in the heart of the Oise department. To his neighbors, Marcel was the picture of stability. He was a quiet, hardworking employee at a local chemical plant and a devoted husband and father. He was a former soldier who had served with distinction, and he was known in the community as a champion marksman at the local shooting club. He was, by all accounts, a model citizen. However, when the investigators looked closer at Marcel's schedule, the cold reality began to settle in. Every single murder had occurred on a night when Marcel was working the late shift or traveling to and from the factory. Even more chillingly, the path he took on his moped every day passed within a few hundred yards of almost every crime scene. He wasn't a monster from a movie. He was the man who waved to his neighbors every morning while he leaned against his fence, a quiet smile on his face as he watched the world go by. The police decided to move in, but they knew they needed more than just a coincidence of timing. They executed a search warrant on Marcel's home while he was away at work. In the basement, behind a false wall, they found a hidden workshop that made the lead investigator's blood run cold. There, neatly organized on a workbench, were hundreds of rounds of .22 caliber ammunition. Next to them was a high-powered rifle fitted with a custom-made silencer and a sophisticated telescopic sight. The weapon was clean, oiled, and ready for use. But the most damning piece of evidence was a small hand-drawn map tucked inside a notebook. On this map, Marcel had marked the railway stations of the Oise department. Next to several of the stations, he had written dates and times, along with small cryptic symbols that corresponded to the locations where the victims had been found. He wasn't just recording his crimes, he was studying them, refining his technique with the cold detachment of a scientist. He had turned the entire region into his own private shooting range. When Marcel was finally arrested, he didn't scream or protest his innocence with the typical fervor of a wrongly accused man. He remained eerily calm, his face a mask of emotionless indifference. During the interrogation, he spoke in a low, measured voice, showing no remorse for the lives he had extinguished. He seemed more interested in the technical details of the ballistics than the human suffering he had caused. He was a man who had completely disconnected from the reality of his actions, living a double life that no one in his inner circle had ever suspected. The trial of Marcel Barbeau was a media sensation in France. The public couldn't reconcile the image of the quiet family man with the terrifying railway sniper who had hunted women in the dark for years. The defense tried to argue that he was suffering from a psychological break, but the prosecution pointed to the meticulous planning and the clinical precision of the murders as proof of a cold, calculated mind. In the end, Marcel was sentenced to life in prison, bringing an end to the reign of terror that had haunted the Oise Valley. The legacy of the railway sniper remains a dark chapter in French history. It serves as a reminder that the most dangerous predators aren't always the ones who look the part. Sometimes they are the people we see every day, the ones who blend perfectly into the background of our lives. They are the neighbors who help us with our groceries or the colleagues we share a coffee with. They wait until the sun goes down and the routine of the day fades away, finding their power in the silence of a dark railway embankment. Even today, if you travel through the Oise department on a late evening train, you can feel the weight of that history. When the train pulls away from a lonely station and the hydraulic doors hiss shut, the silence that follows is never quite empty. There is a lingering memory of a time when every rustle in the brush was a potential death sentence and every glint of moonlight was a reason to run. The landscape has changed, but the chill of the sniper's gaze is something that the fog of the valley will never truly wash away. That feeling of being watched by an unseen force is a universal fear, but as terrifying as a human predator can be, they are still bound by the laws of logic and physics. You can lock your doors against a man with a rifle, and you can map out his routes to avoid him. But there are times when the threat doesn't come from a person at all. There are moments when the ground beneath your feet, a place you have trusted your entire life, suddenly decides it no longer wants to be solid, turning a beautiful Sunday afternoon into an apocalyptic roar from the heavens. At precisely 3:20 in the afternoon on Sunday, May 31st, 1970, a 10-year-old boy named Mateo was standing in a line that smelled like popcorn, sawdust, and anticipation. He was wearing his best Sunday clothes, a crisp white shirt that his mother had ironed just that morning because today was a special occasion. A traveling circus, the Circo Barolina, had come to the scenic mountain city of Yungay, Peru. For a kid living in a remote Andean valley, this was the highlight of the year. The air was cool and thin, as it always was in the high altitude of the Andes, but the sun was shining brightly over the white-capped peaks of the Cordillera Blanca. Yungay was often called the Pearl of the Huaylas Valley because it was so beautiful, nestled right at the feet of the massive twin-peaked Mount Huascaran. To Mateo and the hundreds of other children gathered there, the mountain was just a familiar backdrop, a silent, icy giant that had watched over their families for generations. The circus tent had been pitched on a very specific piece of land known locally as Cemetery Hill. It was a high artificial mound built by pre-Inca civilizations hundreds of years ago to serve as a sacred burial ground. Normally, kids wouldn't want to spend their Sunday afternoon playing among the dead, but the hill was the only flat, elevated spot near the town center large enough to hold the colorful canvas tents and the heavy wooden equipment of circus performers. For Mateo, the hill felt like a natural fortress. From its summit, you could look down at the red-tiled roofs of the city, the bustling marketplace, and the ancient stone church in the central plaza. Everything in Yungay felt permanent and unshakable. The families who lived there had deep roots in the mountain soil, and the town was currently full of visitors who had traveled from nearby villages to enjoy the Sunday market and the rare treat of a traveling circus performance. Inside the tent, the atmosphere was electric. Mateo finally made it to his seat on the wooden bleachers, clutching a small bag of sweets. The music started a lively, brassy march that echoed off the canvas walls. Acrobats in glittering costumes were warming up, and the smell of the animals added to the exotic thrill of the afternoon. There were at least 300 children packed into that tent, their laughter drowning out the distant sounds of the city below them. But at exactly 3:32, the music didn't just stop, it was swallowed. A low, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through the bleachers. At first, Mateo thought it was a heavy truck passing by on the road below, but within seconds, the vibration turned into a violent, bone-shaking heave. The ground wasn't just shaking, it was rolling like the surface of the sea. This was a 7.9 magnitude earthquake, and it was tearing the very foundations of the valley apart. Inside the circus tent, the poles began to sway dangerously. Heavy lights swung back and forth like pendulums, and the screams of the children replaced the cheerful circus music. Mateo felt his stomach drop as he was tossed from his seat. He scrambled to his feet, his hands scraping against the rough wooden planks as he tried to understand what was happening. To people living in Peru, tremors were common, but this felt like the earth itself was trying to break open. The shaking lasted for 45 agonizing seconds. When it finally stopped, a heavy, dusty silence fell over the tent. Some of the children began to cry, while others started to move toward the exits. The circus performers, sensing the danger, began shouting for everyone to stay calm, but Mateo didn't look at the performers. He looked through a gap in the tent flap toward the north, toward the massive, jagged silhouette of Mount Huascaran that loomed over the city. In the sudden silence following the quake, Mateo heard a sound that didn't make any sense. It wasn't the sound of falling buildings or screaming people. It was a deep, guttural roar that felt like it was coming from the sky. It was a sound so loud and so heavy that it vibrated in his chest. He stepped out of the tent and looked up, and his heart stopped. The north peak of the mountain, a wall of solid ice and rock, had simply disappeared into a massive white cloud. What Mateo was witnessing was a geological catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. The earthquake had triggered a massive glacial collapse. A slab of ice and rock nearly a mile wide had broken off the peak and was now plummeting toward the valley floor. As it fell, it gathered speed and picked up millions of tons of mud boulders and water. It was no longer just an avalanche, it was a liquid wall of destruction moving at over 200 miles per hour. The circus performers, many of whom were from Europe and had never seen an avalanche, didn't realize the danger at first. But the local adults on the hill knew exactly what that sound meant. They began to scream at the children to run. They didn't tell them to run toward the town to find their parents. They pointed toward the very top of Cemetery Hill, toward the highest point of the pre-Inca mound. They knew that the city of Yungay, situated in the direct path of the flow, was already lost. Mateo began to run. His lungs burned as he sucked in the thin, dusty air. Around him, hundreds of other children were scrambling up the steep sides of the mound, tripping over the ancient stones and each other. He didn't look back, but he could hear the roar getting louder every second. It sounded like 1,000 freight trains were crashing into each other just behind his heels. The ground beneath him began to tremble again, not from an earthquake, but from the sheer weight of the approaching flow. He reached the highest point of the hill, a small plateau where the most prominent graves were located. He turned around just in time to see the unthinkable. A dark, roiling wall of gray mud and massive boulders, some as large as houses, burst over the ridge above the city. It didn't look like water. It looked like a living, breathing monster made of earth. It hit the outskirts of Yungay and simply erased them. There was no sound of crashing timber or breaking glass. There was only the roar. Mateo watched, paralyzed with horror, as the wave of debris swept across the valley. The beautiful red-tiled roofs, the bustling marketplace, and the stone church where his parents had likely gone after the market, all of it vanished in a heartbeat. The wall of mud was over 80 feet high, and it moved with a terrifying fluid grace. It filled the valley from side to side, turning a vibrant, living city into a flat gray wasteland of sludge and jagged rock. The wave hit the base of Cemetery Hill with a sound like a physical blow. The earth groaned as the pressure of the mud slammed against the ancient mound. Mateo watched as the circus tent, where he had been sitting only minutes before, was snatched away and pulverized. The mud rose up the sides of the hill, licking at the feet of the children who had made it to the top. For a moment, it seemed like the hill itself would be swallowed, and Mateo closed his eyes, waiting for the end. But the ancient builders of the mound had done their work well. The hill held. The main force of the flow divided around the base of the cemetery like water flowing around a boulder in a stream. The roar continued for several more minutes as the tail end of the debris passed by, and then quite suddenly the sound began to fade. The overwhelming noise was replaced by a soft, eerie hissing sound, the sound of settling mud, and the hiss of trapped air escaping the debris. When Mateo finally opened his eyes and looked down, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. Where the city of Yungay had been just 5 minutes ago, there was nothing. No streets, no houses, no trees. It was a perfectly flat, gray plain of wet mud and boulders. The only things left standing were 4 lone palm trees that had been on the outskirts of the main plaza. Their trunks were buried halfway in the mud, their fronds tattered and gray, standing like tombstones over a mass grave. Out of a population of 25,000 people, nearly everyone was gone. In those few minutes, an entire culture and 1,000 years of history had been buried under 30 feet of solid earth. On top of Cemetery Hill, about 350 survivors, mostly children and circus performers, stood in a stunned, ghostly silence. They were standing on an island of the dead, surrounded by a sea of mud that had just claimed everyone they had ever known and loved. The aftermath was a nightmare of isolation. The mud was too soft to walk on, leaving the survivors trapped on the hill as the sun began to set. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the children huddled together for warmth among the graves of their ancestors. The colorful circus costumes were now covered in gray silt, and the performers who had been brought there to make people laugh were now the only adults left to comfort the hundreds of orphans standing on the ground. Mateo sat on a stone ledge, staring out at the 4 palm trees. He waited for his mother or father to appear for some sign of life to break through the gray surface of the valley. But as the moon rose over the peaks of the Andes, the only sound was the wind whistling through the tattered canvas of the destroyed circus tent. The ancient burial mound had fulfilled its original purpose once again, but this time it was the only place where the living could still find footing. It would take days for rescue teams to reach the valley, and when they did, they found a scene that looked like the end of the world. The city of Yungay was never rebuilt. Instead, it was declared a national cemetery, a sacred place where the earth itself is the monument. The children of the circus were eventually taken away to begin new lives, carrying with them the memory of the afternoon when a traveling show on the hill became the only sanctuary in the world that had literally fallen from the sky. This kind of sudden, absolute deletion of a community is a horror that usually requires the raw, unthinking power of a mountain. But as Mateo learned on that hill, sometimes the most terrifying threats are the ones that hide in the places where you are supposed to feel the safest. While a mountain is a visible, looming giant, there are other predators that are much more subtle. They don't fall from the sky, they live right next door, hiding their true faces behind masks and quiet lives waiting for the sun to go down. In the middle of a warm July night in 1960, a father in the parish of St. Peter on the island of Jersey woke up to a sound that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't the wind or the settling of the old stone farmhouse. It was the rhythmic, shallow breathing of someone standing right at the foot of his bed. When he opened his eyes, he saw a silhouette that defied logic. It was a man, but his head was grotesquely large, and his face was frozen in a terrifying smile. The figure didn't move an inch. He just stood there in the pale moonlight, watching the man and his wife as they slept. The father tried to scream, but his throat felt like it was filled with dry sand, and his voice wouldn't come. By the time he finally found his courage and lunged for the bedside lamp, the figure had vanished into the shadows of the hallway as if he were made of smoke. This was the first sign that the peaceful paradise of Jersey was no longer a safe place. To understand how terrifying this was, you have to understand the geography of Jersey. It is a small emerald island sitting in the English Channel just off the coast of France. In the 1960s, it was a place where people left their keys in the ignition and their front doors unlocked. It was a community built on trust and ancient tradition. There was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, which meant that if a monster was on the island, he was almost certainly one of your own. For the next 11 years, this figure, who the press eventually dubbed the Beast of Jersey, became a living nightmare for the residents. He didn't want money, and he didn't want jewelry. He wanted to break into homes while families were asleep and target the most vulnerable. He would climb through open windows, move through the dark hallways with a ghostly silence, and leave behind a wake of psychological trauma and physical evidence that pointed to a very dangerous predator. Despite the island being only 45 square miles, the police were completely powerless to stop him. They launched the largest investigation in the history of the states of Jersey police, but the attacker was always one step ahead. He knew every back road, every hidden coastal path, and every weakness in the island's defenses. It was as if he could see through the stone walls of every house. The residents began to live in a state of high alert, boarding up their windows for the first time. Imagine being a parent on this island during that decade. Every time a floorboard creaked or a branch tapped against a window pane, you would find yourself sitting bolt upright in the dark, your heart hammering against your ribs. You would spend your nights patrolling your own hallways with a flashlight, checking on your children every hour, knowing that the person you had shared a pint with at the local pub that afternoon could very well be the one waiting for lights to go out. The children of Jersey grew up with a different kind of folklore. They didn't hear stories about ghosts or ogres. They heard stories about the man in the rubber mask who could walk through walls. The fear became a tangible part of the island's atmosphere, a heavy blanket that settled over the parishes as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. The once vibrant evening culture of the island began to wither away as families retreated into their homes and locked themselves inside. The police were under immense pressure, but they had almost nothing to go on. No fingerprints, no fibers, and no witnesses who could give a clear description of the man behind the mask. He was a phantom, a shadow that appeared and disappeared without leaving a single trace of his true identity. The investigators began to realize that they weren't looking for a drifter or a visitor. They were looking for someone who had spent their entire life studying the rhythm of the island. Year after year, the attacks continued. The beast seemed to go through phases of intense activity, followed by months of silence, which only added to the psychological torture of the residents. Just when they thought it was safe to leave a window cracked for some fresh air, he would strike again in a completely different part of the island. He was methodical, patient, and seemingly invisible to the law. The island was slowly becoming a prison of suspicion and constant grinding fear. Then came a Tuesday evening in September of 1971. A police officer was conducting a routine patrol near the village of St. Clement when he spotted a white car driving erratically through the narrow lanes. The driver was swerving slightly as if he were distracted or unfamiliar with the vehicle. When the officer signaled for the driver to pull over, the man didn't flee or show any signs of panic. He simply slowed down and stopped acting as if he had nothing to hide. The driver was a 47-year-old man named Edward Peisnell. To the officer, he looked like any other local resident, a bit eccentric in his dress, perhaps, but certainly not a monster. He was wearing a dark suit and spoke with a calm, measured tone that suggested he was a man of some standing in the community. However, when the officer checked the car's registration through the radio, he realized the vehicle had been reported stolen just a few hours earlier from a nearby parish. As the officer began to search the interior of the stolen car, he found something in the back seat that made his blood run cold. Tucked under a woolen blanket was a heavy, dark rubber mask with a distorted, frozen grin. Next to it was a long, dark wig and a pair of heavy leather gloves. The officer looked back at Peisnell, who was still standing by the road with a calm expression, and realized that the 11-year nightmare of the island of Jersey might finally be coming to an end. Edward Peisnell was taken into custody, and as the detectives began to peel back the layers of his life, they discovered a world of depravity that was far worse than anything they had imagined. Peisnell lived in a small, nondescript house with his wife, who reportedly had no idea about her husband's nocturnal activities. But Peisnell also maintained a secret hidden cottage deep in the woods of the island, a place that he had turned into a private sanctuary for his own dark rituals. When the police finally located this cottage and forced the door open, they were met with a heavy, cloying smell of damp earth and old leather. The interior was lit only by small, flickering candles that had burned down to stubs. The walls were covered in strange, hand-drawn symbols and occult diagrams. It looked less like a home and more like a twisted temple dedicated to some forgotten dark deity. It was clear that Peisnell had been living a double life for a very long time. The detectives moved through the small rooms of the cottage with their flashlights, their beams cutting through the thick dust. In a corner of the main room, they found a wardrobe made of heavy oak. When they opened it, they found a collection of various masks and costumes, each one more grotesque than the last, but it was a long, heavy trench coat hanging on a peg that caught their attention. It was a dark, weathered garment that looked like something a fisherman might wear. When one of the investigators reached out to move the coat to see what was behind it, he let out a sharp cry and pulled his hand back. His palm was covered in dozens of small red puncture wounds. He looked at the coat in confusion, and then he turned it inside out. The entire lining of the heavy garment had been meticulously sewn with hundreds of long, sharpened steel nails. Every single one of them was pointing inward, designed to press directly against the wearer's bare skin. It was a garment of self-inflicted torture, a suit of pain that Peisnell would wear whenever he went out on his hunts. He would put the coat on and feel the hundreds of sharp points biting into his shoulders, his back, and his chest. He believed that this physical agony helped him to transcend his human identity and fueled the dark, predatory energy he needed to carry out his attacks. It was a physical manifestation of a mind that had completely broken away from healthy reality. The discovery of the nail-lined coat changed the way the police viewed the case. They realized they weren't dealing with a common criminal who was motivated by greed or simple impulse. They were dealing with a man who had turned his own body into a site of ritualistic suffering so that he could better inflict suffering on others. Edward Peisnell had spent his days as a quiet, unremarkable neighbor, but his nights were spent in a state of agonizing preparation for his crimes. As the news of the arrest and the contents of the cottage began to leak out, the island of Jersey was paralyzed by a new kind of shock. People realized that they had passed Edward Peisnell on the street, that they had stood in line with him at the grocery store, and that he had been a part of their community for decades. The realization that a monster could hide so perfectly in plain sight was almost as terrifying as the attacks themselves. The trust of the island was shattered. During the trial, the sheer scale of Paisnel's depravity was laid bare for the world to see. He had committed countless home invasions and assaults over the course of 11 years, and he showed absolutely no remorse for any of it. He sat in the dock with a calm, almost bored expression, as if the horrific details being read aloud had nothing to do with him. He was a man who had successfully partitioned his mind into two separate worlds, and he seemed to prefer the dark one. The prosecution presented the rubber mask and the nail-lined coat as evidence, and the sight of those objects in the sterile environment of the courtroom sent a wave of revulsion through the spectators. These weren't just tools of a crime, they were artifacts of a nightmare. The survivors of his attacks sat in the gallery, finally seeing the man who had haunted their lives for so long. He wasn't a phantom or a giant, he was just a middle-aged man with a suit and a cold, empty gaze. Edward Paisnel was eventually sentenced to 30 years in prison for his crimes. He was sent away to a high-security facility on the mainland, far from the emerald fields and stone farmhouses of Jersey. He would eventually die behind bars, but his departure didn't bring the immediate sense of peace that the islanders had hoped for. The shadow he had cast over the community was too long and too dark to be erased by a simple prison sentence. The island had been changed forever. The children who had grown up in fear of the beast became adults who never quite felt safe in the dark. The doors that had once been left unlocked were now fitted with heavy bolts and security chains. The culture of the island shifted from one of open, neighborly trust to one of guarded privacy. People began to look at their neighbors with a new kind of scrutiny, wondering what might be hiding behind the closed doors of the houses they had passed their entire lives. Even today, if you visit the parish of St. Peter and walk past the old farmhouse where the first attack took place, you can feel the weight of that history. The island is still beautiful, and the waves still crash against the rugged cliffs with the same rhythmic power, but there is a lingering memory of the man in the mask. The story of the Beast of Jersey is a reminder that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that come from far away, they're the ones who live next door. They're the ones who know your name and your habits, the ones who smile at you in the morning and then spend their evenings sewing nails into the lining of a trench coat. It is a chilling truth that stays with you long after the sun goes down and the lights in the village begin to flicker out. The physical fences we build around our homes are meant to keep the world out, but they can also serve to keep a very different kind of darkness locked inside, hidden from public view. This kind of claustrophobic fear is unique to small, isolated communities where there is no escape from the people around you. You are bound by the water and the smallness of the land, forced to confront the truth of your surroundings every single day. But while a small island creates a sense of being trapped with a monster, a vast, freezing wilderness creates a different kind of existential dread. The fear of being completely alone and erased by a secret you can't quite name. Halfway across the world, from the English Channel in a remote and jagged valley in Norway, another woman was learning the true meaning of a different kind of isolation. She didn't have a nail-lined coat or distorted rubber mask, but she was surrounded by a mystery that was just as cold and sharp. She was a woman of elegance in many languages, yet she spent her final days traveling through the biting wind of a place known as Death Valley, carrying a heavy burden of secrets. She moved through the shadows of various Norwegian hotels with a state of hypervigilance that would have made even the residents of Jersey feel a sense of kinship. She was a ghost in her own life, a person who had systematically deleted every trace of who she really was. As she walked toward her final destination among the wet black rocks of the Isdalen Valley, she was preparing for a disappearance that would baffle the world's greatest investigators for over half a century. On a crisp and biting Sunday afternoon in late November of 1970, a university professor and his two young daughters decided to take a hike through a remote valley just outside of Bergen, Norway. The air was so sharp it felt like it was cutting into their lungs, and the ground was a treacherous landscape of wet black rocks and thick, damp moss. This particular area was known as Isdalen, a place so bleak and shrouded in local folklore that the residents had given it a much darker name, Death Valley. For the two girls, the hike was an adventure, a chance to explore the jagged crevices and hidden shadows of the Norwegian wilderness. They scrambled over boulders, and through the mist, their laughter echoing off the steep gray cliffs. But as they rounded a massive pile of jagged stones near a scree slope, the youngest daughter suddenly stopped in her tracks. She pointed toward a narrow gap between two large boulders, her voice trembling as she asked her father why there was a charred sculpture sitting in the shadows. The professor walked over to where his daughter was standing, expecting to see a piece of driftwood or perhaps the remains of an old campfire. But as he looked down into the crevice, the color drained from his face, and he immediately pulled his daughter's back. It wasn't a sculpture. It was the nude, badly burned body of a woman. She was wedged into the rocks in a strange, almost ritualistic position. Her skin was blackened by fire, and her face was distorted into a mask of silent, frozen agony. The silence of Death Valley suddenly felt heavy and suffocating. The professor didn't wait to investigate further. He gathered his children and hurried back toward the city to find the police. Within hours, the remote valley was swarming with investigators. They moved carefully through the mist, their flashlights cutting through the gray gloom as they began to document the scene. They quickly realized that this wasn't just a tragic accident or a simple case of exposure. This was something far more calculated. Arranged in a deliberate circle around the woman's body were several odd items. There was a pink plastic bottle of water, 2 empty bottles that had once held liquor, a silver spoon with the brand name filed off, and dozens of pink sleeping pills scattered across the damp earth. It looked as though someone had been trying to set the stage for a dramatic final performance. But as the lead investigator knelt down to examine the woman's clothing, he discovered a detail that sent a chill through the entire team. Every single label had been meticulously cut out of her clothes. Whether it was her coat, her dress, or even her undergarments, there was not a single tag left to indicate where they had been purchased or what brand they were. Even the labels on her cosmetics and her hairbrush had been carefully scraped away with a sharp blade. It was as if someone had gone to extreme lengths to ensure that this woman had no history, no origin, and no name. She was a ghost who had been physically erased. The investigation moved from the frozen rocks of the valley to the bustling railway station in Bergen. The police hoped that someone might have seen this striking, elegant woman before she met her end. Their break came when they discovered 2 unclaimed suitcases in the station's luggage department. When the officers forced the locks and opened the bags, they didn't find the typical belongings of a tourist. Instead, they found a collection of items that suggested a life lived in the deep shadows of international intrigue. Inside the suitcases were multiple wigs of different colors and styles, several pairs of non-prescription glasses, and a large amount of cash in various European currencies. There were maps of various cities, but they weren't marked with tourist attractions. They were marked with cryptic symbols. Most baffling of all was a small, leather-bound notebook. It was filled with pages of alphanumeric codes, long strings of letters and numbers that appeared to be a complex encrypted diary of her every move. Cryptographers from the Norwegian military were called in to crack the code. After days of intense work, they realized the woman had been tracking her own travels across Europe. Using at least 8 different forged passports, she had moved through Geneva, Rome, Paris, and London before arriving in Norway. In each city, she used a different alias, often claiming to be an antique dealer or a researcher. She never stayed in one place for more than a few days, and she always paid her hotel bills in cash. The police began to track her final weeks in Bergen by interviewing hotel staff. The portraits they painted were of a woman living in a state of absolute bone-deep hypervigilance. She was described as striking, fluent in multiple languages, and intensely private. One maid recalled that the woman would frequently move the furniture in her room, placing chairs against the door as if she expected someone to burst in at any moment. She often sat in the hotel dining room alone, constantly watching the entrance. One afternoon, a waiter noticed her sitting at a corner table, staring intently at a man who was reading a newspaper across the room. She didn't eat her food, she just watched him with a look of pure, concentrated fear. When the man stood up to leave, the woman dropped her silverware and hurried out of the room in the opposite direction. It was becoming clear that this woman wasn't just a traveler, she was someone who was being hunted, or perhaps someone who was doing the hunting herself. The tension in the investigation reached a breaking point when the forensic report finally came back. The autopsy revealed that the woman had ingested over 50 sleeping pills before she died, but that wasn't what killed her. She had died from a combination of carbon monoxide poisoning and the shock of being set on fire while she was still alive. The fire hadn't been an accident. Someone had poured fuel over her while she was incapacitated by the pills and struck a match in the cold air of the valley. The police were faced with a paradox. If she had taken the pills herself in an act of suicide, how did she manage to set herself on fire and then crawl into a crevice between two boulders? And why would she choose such a remote, desolate place to end her life? The forensic evidence suggested that she had been standing when the fire started, but the placement of her body suggested she had been placed there afterward. The logic of the scene was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. As the detectives dug deeper into the geopolitical climate of 1970, they realized that Bergen was a hotbed of Cold War activity. At the time of the woman's death, the Norwegian military was conducting top-secret tests of the new Penguin missile system in the fjords nearby. Reports began to surface of a mysterious woman being seen near the testing sites, taking photographs and making notes in a small book. The alphanumeric codes in her diary suddenly took on a much more dangerous meaning. Just as the police were preparing to coordinate with Interpol for a massive international search, the Norwegian intelligence service, known as the PST, abruptly stepped in. They didn't offer help. They seized all the files, the suitcases, and the encrypted notebook. They ordered the local police to stop their inquiries and effectively sealed the case under a veil of national security. The official verdict was quietly changed to suicide, despite the glaring forensic evidence that pointed toward a professional execution. The Isdal woman was buried in a nameless grave in a zinc coffin so that her body would be preserved in case anyone ever came forward to claim her. But no one ever did. Not a single relative friend or employer ever reported her missing. She remained a masterpiece of anonymity, a person who had been systematically scrubbed from the face of the earth. The mystery of who she was and what she was doing in that valley has remained one of the most haunting cold cases in the history of espionage. Decades later, advanced DNA testing suggested she might have been born in the border region between France and Germany around 1930. But the trail stopped there. The secret of her identity is likely buried in a declassified file that may never see the light of day. She was a woman who spoke many languages but left no last words, a ghost who was found in a place called Death Valley and then vanished back into the mist of the Cold War, leaving behind nothing but questions. The damp black rocks of Isdalen still stand in the shadow of the cliffs, guarding the spot where the hiker's daughter saw that charred shape in the dark. The valley remains as bleak and silent as it was on that Sunday afternoon, a place where the truth is buried under layers of stone and time. It is a reminder that some secrets are so heavy they can only be carried into the grave, leaving the rest of us to wonder what else might be hiding in the quiet corners of the world. From the silent, encrypted diaries of a spy in Norway to the nail-lined coats of a monster in the English Channel, we have traveled through a landscape of human shadows and terrifying choices. These stories remind us that the world we see during the day is only a fraction of the truth. Behind every locked door and under every remote mountain peak, there are stories waiting to be told. Stories that remind us to keep our eyes open, our hearts steady, and our doors very, very tightly locked. There are exactly 6 separate stories provided in the raw document. These accounts cover a diverse geographical and thematic range, including events in Norway, India, the United Kingdom, Peru, Sweden, and France. Each story presents a unique intersection of human psychology and external threat, spanning from 1969 to 1976, analyze. The first story is the Isdal woman cryptograms from Norway in 1970. This falls under the unresolved mystery category. The central question is who this woman was and why she meticulously erased her identity before her death. I have given this story a hook strength of 9.6 and a mystery strength of 9.9. The audio clarity is a 9.5 because the descriptions of the bleak valley and the coded diary are highly cinematic for a listener. The second story is the voice at the bank counter from India in 1971. This is an investigation and true crime piece. The central question is whether a single man orchestrated a massive heist through vocal mimicry, or if he was a pawn in a larger conspiracy. I have scored this with a mystery strength of 9.4 and an ending impact of 9.4. This story provides a fast-paced political thriller element that balances out the slower atmospheric horror of the other cases. The third story is the nail-lined trench coat from Jersey in 1971. This is categorized as a hidden killer and double life story. The central question is how a quiet neighbor managed to terrorize an entire island for over a decade while hiding a literal house of horrors. The hook strength is a 9.5, and the twist strength is a 9.7. This story is visceral and provides the high-stakes emotional aftershock necessary for a viral true crime script. The fourth story is The Circus on the Hill from Peru in 1970. This is a survival and disaster story. The central question is how a traveling circus on an ancient burial mound became the only place of sanctuary during an apocalyptic landscape. I have scored this with an ending impact of 9.9 and an audio clarity of 9.7. The sound of the avalanche, described as 1,000 jet engines, provides a massive auditory experience for a podcast format. The fifth story is the Vault Paradox at Norrmalmstorg in Sweden in 1973. This is a group in danger story. The central question is why 4 hostages would eventually choose to protect their captors from the police. This story has a hook strength of 9.7 and a twist strength of 9.8. It is the definitive origin of Stockholm Syndrome and serves as an incredible psychological deep dive that keeps the audience questioning human nature. The sixth story is the Railway Sniper of Oise from France, peaking between 1973 and 1975. This falls under the hidden killer category. The central question is how a former military sniper successfully used the regional transit system as a hunting ground for years. I have scored this with a mystery strength of 9.5 and a hook strength of 9.0. It utilizes the everyday fear module perfectly by turning a mundane commute into a high-stakes lottery of survival. This collection is exceptional because it avoids duplicate patterns. We have 1 psychological mystery, 1 political heist, 1 serial killer investigation, 1 natural disaster, 1 hostage situation, and 1 Cold War enigma. This variety ensures the listener never experiences fatigue. The stories transition from urban environments to remote valleys, providing a constant shift in atmosphere that maintains a high level of engagement throughout the entire episode. The emotional core of these stories is the sudden subversion of safety. In every case, a person is in a place they should trust, a bank, a train, a bedroom, or a festival, and that trust is shattered. This aligns perfectly with the target audience's desire for stories where the ordinary world suddenly feels wrong. By prioritizing the viewpoint of the victims, we can build the pressure slowly through small details like a dial tone or a rustle in the tall grass. Organize. To maximize the narrative tension and ensure the most impactful flow for an American audio audience, I have organized the stories in the following order. Story 1 is the Vault Paradox at Norrmalmstorg. We start with a high-energy psychological hook that is world-famous but often misunderstood. This draws the listener in by challenging their logic immediately. Story 2 is the Voice at the Bank counter. This shifts the pace into a political thriller and investigation, keeping the momentum high after the intensity of the Stockholm Bank vault. Story 3 is the Railway Sniper of Oise. This moves into the everyday fear module, using atmospheric dread and the isolation of nighttime travel to slow down the pace and build a different kind of suspense. Story 4 is The Circus on the Hill. This serves as the emotional peak of the episode. It is a massive disaster story that provides a break from human killers and focuses on the overwhelming power of nature and survival. Story 5 is the nail-lined trench coat. We follow the disaster with a visceral horror story. The reveal of the physical objects in the cottage provides a late episode shock that will re-energize the listener for the finale. Story 6 is the Isdal Woman Cryptograms. We end with the ultimate unresolved mystery. This story is quiet, cold, and haunting. It leaves the listener with a sense of lingering unease that is the hallmark of successful mystery storytelling.